What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 155. I'm the co-host Kyle Anzalone, joined by the co-host Will Porter. Will, how's it going today?
Doing great, Kyle. How you doing tonight?
It's a good day, Will. It is the 1 year anniversary of the show. I think we aired the
Oh
first
yeah.
episode August 30th of 2020. Of course, it was just, like a continuation of what we had been doing with foreign policy focus and involving it for video and everything like that. But the first year, Will, has been unbelievably successful. Hundreds of
Yeah.
thousands of downloads. We have thousands of people subscribed to the show. We've added Paloma Verde as a fantastic sponsor. I mean, really, what's a better sponsor for our podcast where we're talking about news and peace than a company who, provides people with, a hemp-based medicine, and it works great. It's very natural, and their logo is a green dove because, Carlos and those guys and his wife Vanessa over there really believe in the peace and the liberty message too. So we've been fortunate to have great sponsors. We have great followers of the show. We got some people that subscribe and donate on Patreon and Subscribestar, or who have donated in library credits or whatever else. We started with the show just pretty much on the Libertarian Institute and podcast format on YouTube. We now got it up at Odyssey and Rumble. Hopefully we'll have our Rockfin page up too. I'm working on getting all the crypto and stuff set up there, but we'll be doing some bonus content there. And just, we got tons of plans for the future to do more stuff, like our recent bonus episode with Magnus Pamvidia. And we finally got more people again following the show now on Facebook. Although, Will, I was looking today and it says like 90% of the people who are watching the videos on Facebook are not following or liking the page. One thing that's made it really difficult to grow the show on Facebook is we have been unable to invite people to like our Facebook page, so you have to hit the like button. I'm sorry, I can't make it easier for you. I'm the only person I know who has this problem. I've asked a bunch of people that are like, no, you just do it, and I'm like, the button is actually gone.
It's gone.
And so, for all like kind of the struggles and setbacks that we've had, videos being taken down on no reason for YouTube, and we're issued a warning for, I think, cyberbullying and harassment, and they didn't even bother to look at the appeal. This was several months ago. We've had just tons of success this year, and a lot of it is because all of our listeners are taking the time to like the show, share the show, making sure you're subscribed to the show so you're not missing episodes. People are moving over to the alternatives like Rumble and Odyssey, because eventually, I think it's probably likely that we may not be on YouTube forever. And so if you're subscribed to the show somewhere else, and make sure that we're not losing our audience when that eventually does happen, because we don't want to moderate the message just to appease the YouTube censors, at least not too much. So Will, anyways, this has been a great year, and I'm sure 2021, 2022 is going to be even a better year for the show, and really looking forward to a lot of things that we have going on. But let's talk about our sponsor just a little bit more, and the great products that they have there at Paloma Verde, PalomaVerdeCBD.com, and the promo code is PEACE, PEACE, to get 25% off when you check out. And Will, I think you have some products that you really like there, so tell the audience what you prefer.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I know you like some of the topicals they have and the salves and creams and stuff. I prefer the soft gels they have. They have a couple different formulations: melatonin, curcumin. The melatonin helps me a lot to wind down and sleep. I have some issues with insomnia. The curcumin, I think, kind of helps with inflammation and stuff. But I also really like their high dose, oil tincture. So, when you've been listening to our show and we're stressing you out with all this bad news, take some of that. It might take some of the edge off. So if that sounds interesting to you, check out PalomaVerdeCBD.com. They've got lab results. They've got all kinds of educational resources. And definitely visit that site.
All right, well, the first story we have up here is, more follow-up from January 6th, which we have been talking about on this show since actually the night of January 6th. And all along, we have not bought this insurrection narrative. In fact, the first day after watching the footage, we were like, that seemed like a little bit of an out of control protest, but not too much more than that. Video surfaces of people hitting cops and everything. But by far the most violent at that day was the shooting of Ashley Babbitt. And that's the only thing, seems to me, that gets praise for happening that day. And in fact, the cop has now come forward, the one that murdered Ashley Babbitt, and is being praised. So we'll explain what's going on here, because it just, when we started this show a year ago, everything was ACAB, right?
Right, yeah, but now it seems that this particular cop is very much being lionized. I don't have a whole lot on this. I kind of just wanted to mention it and maybe direct people to the interview. They can see it themselves. But yes, the Capitol police officer who murdered Ashley Babbitt, one of the rioters on the Capitol in January 6th, he has finally come out and given his first on-record interview with NBC last week. And this guy had been identified in reports several weeks ago as Lieutenant Michael Byrd, and it turns out those reports were correct. That is, he is the guy. And of course, now he's being hailed as this, brave, savior who heroically shot an unarmed woman to death during the Capitol riot. And in this interview, he's very unapologetic. He very much defends what he did that day and says that killing Ashley Babbitt was justified. He said that she was posing a threat to the U.S. House of Representatives. At one point in the interview, he even says that knowing whether she was unarmed would not have made a difference in his decision making. He would have killed her either way. Which I found kind of a weird thing to just freely admit like that. But I don't know. Nobody in media, at least in the corporate press, seems to have much of a problem with that. They think that, I haven't seen that really remarked upon much, that he would have shot whether or not, even if had he known she's unarmed. And the whole thing, I think it was with Lester Holt of NBC. It's a very softball interview. However, at one point, they do ask this guy to account for the fact that none of the other cops at the Capitol during the riot that day fired their weapons. And he kind of didn't have much of a good answer. He just kind of says, I can't account for their decision making. He said it must have been, a terrifying experience for everyone. But if you watch the footage, because there's actually several different angles of the footage where Ashley Babbitt is shot, you see there are cops standing directly behind her. And they actually come and tend to Ashley Babbitt after she was shot, within seconds. They must have been 6 feet away from her or something. And those police officers did not seem to perceive any kind of imminent deadly threat from her or from the people who were around her. None of them seemed to have their guns drawn. And not to mention, this Byrd guy fired into this crowd of people that included these other cops. These police officers were right there. And it's amazing that he didn't, accidentally hit one of them or hit somebody else. But that's another thing that doesn't seem to go remarked upon much in media, of just how reckless this was, of firing his weapon into this crowd of people, including toward police officers, who, again, you can see them right there in the footage. They come and attend to Babbitt within seconds. And so, seemed pretty reckless what he did, but he was not pressed on that very much by the interviewer. He was sort of just asked, why didn't the other police officers shoot their guns? And they kind of just accepted his answer. Now, however, this Byrd guy, it has been decided. Prosecutors, I think they considered possibly charging him, but they have now declined to do that. They say that, he didn't do anything wrong that day and will not get any criminal penalty for killing this woman. I know her family has sued. I think she sued the Capitol Police Department for $10 million. Not totally sure how far along that lawsuit is, but for sure, this Byrd guy is not going to face any kind of criminal penalty. So that's about all I had on this killer cop. People should go and watch the full interview if they want sort of all the details of what he said. But they'll notice, I think, people will notice the coverage of this was all very congratulatory and back-patting, and almost no criticism of the fact that he shot an unarmed person and killed them.
Right. Yeah, and well, I guess the part of this story that I kind of brought up in the very beginning that I think is the most interesting is just how quickly the narrative on police changed after one sits. And right. For the rest of the country, I don't think this was a 9/11 event. But for the media, it certainly has been. We're bad to the full-on flag-waving worshiping. It almost is very reminiscent the past couple weeks in the country of 9/11, where you have the worship of this police officer who killed somebody, and then very similar to the images from 2004, 2005, especially when a lot of dead U.S. soldiers are dying in Iraq. Just the way we respond to that by no accountability for our leaders who get us into the war. No question there. Just, more rah, we need to kill more people. Right. So it's been, really interesting to see how some of this plays up. Will, I guess what anything else on Ashley Babbitt?
No, that was pretty much all I had. I didn't have too much on that segment. I mostly just wanted to kind of highlight the fact that this cop has finally given his first on-record interview, and it is kind of interesting just to see, like how he is portraying the events. He is sort of like painting himself in the light of a victim and all this stuff. And yeah, I just thought I would, highlight that.
All right, Will, let's move on and start talking about Afghanistan, where we have, I mean, just kind of a lot of news to cover. But I guess the big news of the day is the U.S. strike in Kabul. So, what's going on there?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So we have quite a few updates here for Afghanistan. I know you and Connor Freeman on the last show did some great coverage of the bombing outside the Kabul airport. But yeah, there's been quite a bit of stuff that's happened sort of since then and in retaliation for that. Now you mentioned the strike in Kabul. I would like to start. That was actually the second strike. There was a first one on Friday. So this is sort of the major news of the last few days are these retaliatory bombings. But yeah, I believe this first one happened in Nangarhar province out in eastern Afghanistan on Friday, specifically in the city of Jalalabad. And initially, the Pentagon had said that they bombed one planner for ISIS-K, what they call the Islamic State Khorasan cell, which we've discussed on a few previous shows. But later they did update and say that they actually killed two people and wounded another guy. And apparently all of them, they're saying, are members of ISIS. And of course, at that first strike, they say that there were 0 civilian casualties. I think that's yet to be seen, but that is what they're claiming, at least for that first strike. And they did kind of imply that these guys that were hit, that they may have been involved in the airport bombing. But I was watching some of the Pentagon press briefings, and they did stop short of outright saying that. It sounds possible that maybe this was just sort of like a revenge strike on some random ISIS guys that they happen to have some intelligence on. And this is also assuming too that these were actually ISIS guys. Like I think we are kind of taking the Pentagon's word for this, especially because they are refusing right now to identify any of the people who they targeted. But for now, they are saying that these were ISIS, quote, facilitators and planners. And in the briefing, there was some like discussion. I know reporters were trying to get a little more detail on like, what does that mean? What, like, was this guy a planner for the airport bombing? And the Pentagon would not really specify. They just say these were ISIS planners and they're now dead and they're now off the battlefield.
Well,
go ahead.
I'm just curious. Is there any reporting about if this strike was coordinated with the Taliban and all? Just one situation that you kind of got to realize if you're the U.S., you got a lot of personnel at the Kabul airport there that's going to take, several hours in the best case scenario to get out of the airport. And so I would guess you would want to, make sure you don't do anything to upset the Taliban too much, because I did see today that the Taliban came out and condemned the strike. I guess they could condemn it and at the same time, just kind of shrug their shoulders and not do anything about it, or you have even been forewarned that the strike was going to happen, but you really can't do anything about it anyways.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like working with the I know that the General McKenzie that CENTCOM had, he did say something about how the U.S. had passed some U.S. intelligence to the Taliban, and he says he believes that they thwarted some attacks. But in terms of the drone strike or anything, I'm not sure if there was any like communication about that. Did I understand your question correctly? Is that what you were asking me?
Yep.
Okay,
yeah,
great.
you did. All right. So should we move on to the Kabul strike?
Oh no, I just had a couple other things
okay,
here.
Go ahead.
So for the first one in Jalalabad, they are not saying exactly how the strike was carried out. And this also applies to the second one in Kabul as well. But they're calling these over the horizon operations, which I believe means they launched them from outside of Afghanistan. But the Pentagon spokesman John Kirby would not be any more specific than that. He just kept saying this was an over the horizon mission, and he also wouldn't say what kind of drone was used. And I believe the Reaper drone has like quite a bit more range than the Predator, but I have no clue where they might have launched this from, whether it was maybe Pakistan or I don't know. I was thinking possibly the Al Udeid base in Qatar, but where CENTCOM is headquarters. But that is kind of far away to be hitting Nangarhar, so I'm not totally sure where this was launched from. We do also, I think, have a carrier strike group in the Gulf right now. And I have read some things about them outfitting some of these ships with the ability to launch drones, but I don't know if that's something that they're doing or whether they did it then. But yeah, that is about all I had on the first strike there in Nangarhar.
All right.
But did you have anything else on that one, or
no.
Just hop right into? Okay, great. So yeah, today actually, the day we're recording, Sunday, there was another U.S. drone strike. This time in Kabul itself, the capital city, and apparently they're saying it was in the Kaji Bugra neighborhood. which is like 2 miles away from the airport. So we're talking like very close to the vicinity of this huge evacuation effort. And they're claiming that the second strike hit a car or a truck that was carrying explosives and linked to the Islamic State. And I don't think they were super specific. They said it could have been a vehicle-borne IED, or maybe it was an ISIS guy with a suicide vest or something. But they are saying that that's what they hit. However, in this case, it does appear that they did kill civilians. CNN had a report. They spoke to one of the brothers of one of the victims, apparently, and he says that 9 members of his family were killed in this strike, and that includes 6 children. And actually, in their announcement, when they announced this strike, CENTCOM even said something about assessing the possibilities of civilian casualties. And I think that's about as close as an official admission as you're going to get at this point. Because you'll recall that after the first strike, they said, like, they're sure 0 civilian casualties, whereas this one they're saying they're assessing the possibility. And so it seems pretty likely that, that probably did occur. There were civilians killed in this. You kind of alluded to this earlier, but the Taliban did respond to this, to the second one. I'm not sure if they responded to that first strike, but a spokesman did come out and say something that, like, they should not conduct operations on other people's soil. And he said that we will condemn any strikes like this. And so that was kind of interesting to see them, take a stance against that. Now, Joe Biden did mention that after that first strike, there would be more retaliation after that first strike. And so I guess they did, go through with that. And they are still talking about right now some kind of ongoing threat from ISIS-K. So who knows? By the time people hear this, there may have been, another strike. Now, last thing I will say, we're supposed to be completely out of Afghanistan now by August 31st. However, all along they have talked about keeping this sort of over-the-horizon presence there, and that is how they're describing these 2 strikes. And so I'm not sure if that, even if we are completely out by August 31st, I'm not sure if that rules out similar strikes like this going forward.
Yeah, I mean, that all great points, Will, and thanks for the coverage. I guess I don't even have anything to add to that, and other than it, being too early to really speculate on too much else. Then, I guess one thing I did pick up is the U.S. had I guess warned that there was potentially going to be a car bomb in Kabul. Kind of interesting, I guess, that they don't hit it until it's already in kind of a crowded area. Maybe it came out of a garage in Kabul. I don't know, but it seems like this was a dangerous, high risk airstrike to bomb it in such a crowded area.
Right, yeah, right in the middle of the capital city.
Yeah. Will, anything else on that, or any other Afghan news?
Yeah. I just had there's a couple updates, a couple things just to clarify. Initially, it was reported that in this airport bombing that there was 2 bombs that went off. They'd said one went off by an airport gate and another went off by a hotel that was nearby. However, I believe on Friday the Pentagon came out and said that the second bomb was some kind of false alarm, I guess, that there was actually only one blast. I don't know why or how that people thought there was another bomb or how that got reported so widely, because it was literally everywhere that it was 2 bombings. But at least according now to the official account from the U.S. government, there was only 1 bomber.
Okay.
And then in terms of the sort of death toll, there's all kinds of conflicting numbers that I've seen, but I believe the last figure was 170 Afghans that had been killed. And of those, the Taliban says 28 of those were their own members. I guess some fighters, some could be civilian Taliban members. But then also there's, of course, the 13 American soldiers. And then there were also 2 British nationals, I think, who were killed in this. And so there's been some sort of updates on the death toll.
All right. Well, I got just a couple other stories that I wanted to mention. The U.S. continues to evacuate from Afghanistan. I guess they will probably be doing that for another day here. The U.S. says that they have taken out over 114,000 people. It's not exactly clear to me where all these people are. I'm guessing that a lot of them are living in really, really poor conditions right now, and that this is going to be somewhat of a humanitarian disaster that we're looking at. But I believe this just includes, the U.S. is saying that the U.S. alone flew out 114,000. I think the Brits have put out that they flew out 15,000. I'm not sure, how much other coalition partners did, but Hungary, Australia, Denmark, all these countries had flights out of Afghanistan. So I'm guessing that well over 150,000 total were flown out by U.S. coalition forces. The U.S. says there's just over 1,000 civilians that remain at the airport to be flown out. I'm not sure if that means that they're no longer taking new people into Afghanistan. One thing to note, Will, is that the Taliban are saying that anybody who has American citizenship or a foreign national or has, like a travel visa to another country, they're going to allow to leave. And so I'm even wondering now, maybe as some of the traffic has slowed down at the Kabul airport because of a risk of another attack, because of the mob, how many people are down there, how risky that is. Right. Maybe they're hoping that the Taliban will just let them leave and they'll be able to get on flights in the weeks and months to come. And so just because we're getting to the end of the U.S. flying people out, I don't think we're at the end of the wave of refugees that we're going to see coming from Afghanistan. Right. So just, some interesting notes there I picked up. The Turkey said, who has been securing the Kabul airport, that repairs are needed before civilian flights could begin. So I'm not sure where the damage is. I'm guessing it's not to the runway, so planes could still come in and take off, but they did say damage to the terminals, and I think they also said flight towers being for some of the reasons that these things would need to be repaired. I guess Turkey is in talks right now with the Taliban on providing the personnel in Afghanistan at the Kabul airport to be able to operate this thing. So my guess, Will, now that I think about this, is that the airport probably has been operated by largely like maybe Western militaries and stuff like that. But to the extent that there were Afghans involved, these are people that were probably heavily tied to the Western military occupation, and were probably some of the first people that left, or will be that, or maybe they're there till the end, but they're going to be evacuated. And so I'm really wondering if the Taliban will need Turkey to bring in this personnel to continue to operate the airport at all. Another interesting story that came out, Will, was that the U.S. had provided the Taliban a list of citizens and then people who they wanted to be able to cross checkpoints and get out of the country. This was really portrayed and tried to use be used as fodder against the Biden administration by the Hots, but it does. I saw a lot of reports of the citizens, like the Western citizens, being able to get through the checkpoints. And so while there may be some downside, and I hope the Biden administration maybe communicated with people and either let them know that they were giving their names to the Taliban, or hopefully preferably said like, hey, we could do this to maybe make it easier, would you like to take that risk? In which case, this is a little bit less offensive and almost understandable. But it does, despite what the Republican talking points have been through all of this, the U.S. has successfully dealt with the Taliban through all of their takeover of Kabul. Imagine the Taliban have been at war with the U.S. for almost 2 decades, right? And I guess the first couple of years after the U.S. drove them out, there wasn't that much active insurgency and stuff, but we're talking about years and years of war here, Will, and the Taliban could have been real jerks about it and fought until every last American left as soon as possible, and probably could have killed a lot more Americans than the 13 that were killed by the Islamic State bomb. But the U.S. has managed, and one of the things that I think credit has to be given to the Biden administration too is like William Burns has traveled to Afghanistan. They have been kind of ridiculous through all of this, and it's not like they carried out these drone strikes and the Taliban opposed them and stuff like that. I think the U.S. was flying F-16s over Kabul last week as like a show of force. Like these kind of things have happened, but at the same time, they have engaged in enough diplomacy to kind of make it work.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you see some of these hawks like Blinken, the Secretary of State, I think he was on like CBS or something, and it was like, are you saying we're giving the legitimacy to the Taliban? We're negotiating with the Taliban? And he's like, we've been negotiating with the Taliban for like well over a year now. Like, what do you think all the Doha agreements were? Like, yes, of course we're in communication with the Taliban. Like, they're pretty much the government of Kabul now. And I did see a lot of like a huge hawkish reaction of, oh my God, they're giving the Taliban hit lists of Americans to kill. But it seemed that was kind of a overblown reaction. Like, I don't think the Taliban is going to start then use that to start assassinating Americans trying to get out.
Oh, I mean, it is something to consider as a possibility, and like I said, I hope that the American side at least, let people know that their name was on the list
Right.
at the very minimum. So if the Taliban do start offing people on the list, they know to run. Um,
Right.
Will, one of the things that you tweeted out that I thought was pretty important and powerful was the ages and the names, but particularly the ages of those killed in the ISIS suicide attack, just to show that almost I'm most people wouldn't think of me as old as all, but I actually am young or older than everybody but one person on this entire list.
Yeah.
And so I'm guessing it's actually the same case for you, and it's absolutely crazy because that means that these people were toddlers, just when 9/11 happened at best, like infants and toddlers, right? And
Yeah.
now that they've died in this war, so Will, any comments you have on that? But also, let's talk about the attack because other than the very good correction you gave earlier in the show when you explained that there was only one bomb, at least according to the U.S. military at this point, because before it had been widely reported there were two. What other possible events happened and what's being reported?
Yeah, sure, sure. So just on the first thing, it's just, yeah, that really is a tragic kind of symbolic thing. Like, to see the number of 20-year-olds on this list, people who, like, I hope these are some of the last soldiers to die at the tail end of this horribly pointless, disastrous war that we fought here. But some of them, they don't even remember why we're there. They weren't, like, maybe they were born on 9/11, but they were way too young to even to remember what happened. And so, this multi-generational war now, it's all been absolutely for nothing. And I think these young kids on this list really kind of symbolize that. So that's really unfortunate.
Yeah.
Um, Now, in terms of what the other thing you were referring to of other, sort of unsolved mysteries, I guess, after this bombing, we have been getting some reports that some of the people who died in this bombing were not killed by the bomb itself, but instead by American machine gun fire. And I will say, initially, I was fairly skeptical of this. Somebody sent me a video of this local Afghan journalist who's interviewing a guy who I believe was some kind of volunteer or aid worker. And he says he is or used to be a military officer, I guess presumably in the Afghan military. And this guy says that he had seen the bodies of some of these victims of the bombing, and that he says they were clearly killed by bullets, that they had gunshot wounds in their heads and their necks and their upper bodies, and that it looked like they were hit from some kind of elevated position, like just judging by like the angle of the wounds and the exit wounds and stuff. And this guy claims that all but 20 of the victims were actually shot by American soldiers, not killed by the bombs. And so I heard that, and I didn't just completely dismiss the guy, as a liar or something, but I was sort of skeptical. I wasn't just going to take this one person's thing at his word. However, then I saw this BBC report where they're now citing multiple witnesses who say the exact same thing, that foreign soldiers guarding the airport fired into the crowd and killed people after this bombing. One of the guys they interviewed said that it may have been American or Turkish troops, but he also mentioned sort of how the bullets were coming from above, like as if from one of the guard posts, like an elevated position. Then there was another guy they had spoken to, and he said how
Can I just add real quick?
Sure, sure.
That when somebody was shot outside of the Kabul airport last week, they actually reported it was a member of the Afghan armed forces. And so I believe that there are, I guess, I actually saw an article, maybe the Red Brigade of the Afghan National Army is still formed up and is helping to provide this security. I have no idea what the long-term plan for these guys is. My guess is they're going to be on the planes headed out of the country, but maybe the U.S., they're so in some way okay with the Taliban because obviously they're providing some of the security at the airport and everything. But it is possible, I guess, that these were Afghan forces. It's not like it's only American and Turkish forces still at the airport.
Right, right, absolutely. Yeah, it's not totally clear that, like, just even if it was an airport security guard who did shoot, it's not necessarily clear it wasn't American. There are other nationalities still around there. However, there was another guy that they spoke to with the BBC, and he said that like he knew one of the guys who was killed after this, and the quote was something like, the reason he lost his life, he was not killed by the Taliban, he was not killed by ISIS. And then the quote kind of gets garbled, but it sounded like he said U.S. Army started shelling or shooting. It's not totally clear what he said, but he's saying that like this was not a bomb that killed, somebody shot my friend after this. And so there are some witness reports that that somebody was shooting into this crowd that was not ISIS. According to the Pentagon, like after the bomb went off, there was some small arms fire from some unknown enemy position. So it's not totally implausible to think that maybe these American forces shot back. However, we also then have this Politico journalist, Laura Seligman, and she cited three anonymous sources who said that the U.S. forces did return fire after the attack. And so we do have some reason to believe that they were shooting into this crowd. And by U.S. forces, I'm not sure. Maybe, like you said, maybe she could mean like allied forces, but definitely we have some indication that this happened. And besides the BBC, though, almost nobody in the Western media seems to be interested in figuring this out, like and asking this question. Now, Idris Ali of Reuters, who we cite on this show quite a bit, he does pretty good work for a mainstream journalist. He did ask the Pentagon press secretary about this during a recent briefing. He just asked, is it possible that any U.S. Marines shot or killed Afghans after this bombing? And John Kirby didn't deny it. He said that, like, we can't confirm that, but he said, quote, certainly we're not in a position to deny it either. And so, I'm not sure how likely it is that we will ever get an admission or a official explanation of this. But at the moment, they are not denying that this happened, and we do have some pretty good indication that it did. So, definitely something that I would like to return to and keep looking into.
Certainly, if no U.S. forces shot on that day, I think John Kirby would have said no U.S. forces fired their weapons. And
That's correct, yeah.
It could have been that they shot into the air. Now, other things for people to just consider here before, you assume that was just like a mass slaughter situation. There was, 14 dead, 13 dead American soldiers, presumably. Some of them were either injured and about to die, or there's maybe other U.S. soldiers who were injured and later survived, right? And so, if you have them laying there bleeding out in this mass chaos, because people thought that there were two explosions at least, that was widely reported from sources on the ground, and so you had this mass chaos. You have what looks like a lot of people falling into like this sewage canal situation that was right next to where the bombing was, and there's some video that looks like maybe people were like drowned in there or crushed to death in that situation. But so if you do have injured soldiers laying there and like a stampede of people are coming towards them, somebody opens fire. I wouldn't be surprised if somebody did that in that situation. It's still horrible, but this is just like the absolute chaos of war and why you don't do this kind of stuff in the first place. I also think it's possible that maybe somebody in the crowd either had a weapon or looked like they had a weapon, or for whatever reason somebody thought they had a weapon. Once people start shooting, then maybe somebody else is like, oh, somebody like thinks that actually that the other side is shooting, so they, what I mean, these kind of things happen, these high elevation, when people are like so adrenaline, fight or flight, and who knows how many of these guys have like actually seen combat or anything before. It could have been like their first experience in something like this. Also, maybe like
really young,
even maybe like a Taliban fighter or something, like coming up to see what's going on, has a gun and somebody starts firing into the crowd. There's just so many options of what could have possibly happened here, and we have no answers because the Western press doesn't seem at all interested in the lives of Afghans ever, really. And so the U.S. soldiers that died, we had to get retribution and justice for them. But let's say some Afghans died at the hands of U.S. soldiers, or hell, like today, usually the articles you gotta like get 4 or 5 paragraphs into them before they even mention that civilians died.
That's right.
And these are children, the people that we should be, protecting the most in our society. Will, anything about this? Again, I don't think you're saying that this story is confirmed to be true. You're just, and I was very dismissive of it as first too, and then you had kind of filled me in on what you found, and particularly the Politico report, and what John Kirby said makes me think that this maybe is something that could have, and even if it wasn't, he said 20 people died, there's 170 dead, and I don't know if 150 people were shot to death by the U.S., but it could have even been just a couple. Is still absolutely tragic and disturbing.
Yeah, I mean, like, definitely, like you said, I'm not arguing this is definitely a confirmed thing. I'm also wouldn't even if it were confirmed, I would not say this is a deliberate massacre or something. I think it would have been just total, an effect of just the confusion of the situation and all that. But yeah, I definitely am very interested to figure out more about this. I did reach out to the Afghan journalist who initially talked to the aid worker where this claim where I had initially seen it. I have not gotten a response from them yet, but I will definitely keep you guys updated if I hear more.
All right, well, you have been busy on Twitter, not just putting together these great Twitter threads and breaking down what announcements the U.S. is making and what it means and stuff like that, which, even when you're not on the show, we're talking about it on the show.
Right.
But you've had some pretty sassy combats to some of the worst of the hots. And so I just wanted to go through some of these tweets and your responses. The first is from Jeremy, Boring? He's from the Daily Wire. And he says, we should not have pulled our troops from Afghanistan. He puts a period and then he writes period with a period. So, tell us about this one.
Yeah, I just thought this is funny. This is a high up guy at the Daily Wire. It's supposed to be this like big conservative outlet. And my quip was just sort of like, I'm not sure what's so conservative about a gigantic multi-trillion-dollar nation-building project that expropriated all this money from American taxpayers. I thought these conservative guys are supposed to be, limited government or whatever. They like to talk a nice libertarian game, but of course, when it comes to actually ending a gigantic government policy like this, he's completely opposed to it. And I just, of course, didn't get any answer from him. I said, I wonder if you could explain what's so conservative about that policy. He never did explain it to me, but I just thought that was ironic for the Mr. Conservative man to be backing such a Wilsonian kind of give the world democracy kind of policy.
Well, it's interesting that as soon as Biden, starts to do anything to the worst state at all, the Republicans instantly give up. At least all the mainstream Republicans instantly give up any of the, kind of pretext of end the endless wars that they had kind of muttered during the Trump or even Obama years because it was politically popular among the base. But now that they could blame it on Biden, I think they're able to, the Republican voters are willing to hate on Biden, that feeling is stronger for them over than their desire to end the wars. And so we're seeing just a lot more of this kind of like low IQ Republican trying to dunk on Biden for ending this thing. And yeah, the pullout wasn't the greatest thing, Will, but at the same time, it was the right decision to get our troops out of there. Republicans, particularly conservative Republicans, should be praising Biden for at least this. Next Absolutely. Up, we have Charles Lister, who says, in many respects, Afghanistan represents the first real implementation of ending forever wars doctrine. The results thus far, and he has 5 bullet points here: crumbling of a democratic government, Taliban rule, Al-Qaeda ecstatic, emergency mass evacuation, unprecedented transatlantic divisions. So, Will, what do you think of that? What did you say about this one?
Yeah, I just love that this is all attributed to ending the war, as if this is not a result of the 20-year exercise that we just attempted. All the things he just listed are reasons and proof of why it was such a failure. But he's saying that, no, that only happened when you leave. But like, obviously this stuff is very long in the making. We just spent 20 years there doing all this stuff, building this so-called democratic government that collapsed before we were even out of there. I mean, at least with the Soviets, their communist puppet state, at least that thing stood for like a year or so before, after they left, before the thing collapsed. We weren't even out of the country yet before ours did. And it's just, I don't know, it's just incredible to blame this on the withdrawal and not the 20 years of, effort that we put in prior to that.
Yeah. Well, the first bullet point, the part that really upset me was calling it a democratic government. I've been saying this, that a lot of these hots are pretending that up until a week ago, or I guess now 3 weeks ago, Afghanistan was France and they just held regular elections, and Ghani was the guy who got elected and he formed a government, and it wasn't, years of elections being delayed, and then once it finally happened, thousands of polling sites didn't even open, and there was violence at tons of polling sites. Polling workers were killed. I think only like 20% of eligible voters actually voted in the election. And once it finally happened, it took 9 months to call, or 6 to 9 months to call a winner. And once they called a winner, the top 2 candidates both decided they were winners, swore themselves in, and actually were both on TV holding in competing swearing in ceremonies. And then the guy who got declared the winner by the West actually had had to negotiate with his top competitor and allow him into his government. It wasn't even a situation where, he just won the election. That was it. Taliban rule isn't a problem. Al Qaeda, I haven't heard Al Qaeda as static at all. And in fact, the Taliban consider themselves the enemy to the main, I guess, jihad, the closest thing to a real jihadist group that you have in Afghanistan right now, ISIS-K. The emergency evacuations are just a result of ending a 20-year occupation. And the last note, the unprecedented transatlantic divisions, this one cracks me the hell up, because this is the one thing that these people said Biden was supposed to fix. Now, there is a little bit, now I think he's far exaggerating that this is unprecedented, but the UK, their parliament did condemn Biden for this, like specifically passed, like, I think it was like a resolution or the equivalent of that. But it is interesting that you have so many people upset within NATO for the US ending this war finally, and that being the reaction of so many people. Anything else on the list or tweet?
No, that's pretty much it.
All right, Eli Lake is up next, who says the anti-war movement has finally gotten what it wanted, that they ended the forever war in Afghanistan. As a result, women will return to bondage, our allies will be murdered, America has been humiliated, and Afghanistan is a safe haven for terror.
Yeah, my response to that was America humiliated itself as soon as it embarked on the impossible mission of giving Afghanistan a liberal democracy in a box. And then, of course, I mentioned that Lake says nothing. He does not mention the brutal warlords that we got into bed with to make this great, liberal democracy happen. He mentions nothing about the absolute endemic corruption of the Afghan government that just for years has been, ground to a halt by this corruption. And that, we see the results of just how the whole thing had been hollowed out. It collapsed immediately. And then, of course, the torture, too. That torture has been absolutely endemic and widespread in the Afghan security forces. So, like, all this stuff he's saying of, like, oh, what a disaster this is all becoming. Like, where were you when all this other stuff had been happening? All the, these very dark things, especially the torture. I mean, that's not an anomaly. I mean, it seems like all the regimes that we sort of, like, the little puppet states that we back, there's always massive allegations of torture. I mean, even going to, like, the Iraqi forces that we work with, the militias that we work with over there, insane levels of torture. And so that is sort of like an MO of people we get into bed with, is that they torture people to death. But of course, Eli Lake will have he'll make no mention of that. Afghanistan was just this peaceful, great liberal democracy until the second we left, apparently.
Yeah, this one was something else. But Will, what I wanted to point out with this tweet is I'm starting to see a narrative form here where the Hawks are trying to spin this to blame everything on the people who have opposed this stupid war all along. It's absolutely crazy, and we could get into more when we break down the Wolfowitz and Kagan articles coming up. But they just keep adding to it. Anything else about our friend Eli Lake?
No, that's pretty much it.
All right, this next one, Will, is almost crazy. It's the Richard Haas tweet, and I guess I didn't load it up. But he basically says that the occupation in Afghanistan is no different than U.S. deploying troops to Germany, Korea, or Japan. And this guy, just to clarify, we're not like picking on scrubs here or anything like that. This isn't like, the lady who writes at the Washington Post on the food blog or something like that. She writes about like, the new food coming out in Russia or Iran or wherever else. No, this is the head of the Council on Foreign Relations saying this, that there's just no different, and we shouldn't define troops being in Afghanistan differently than Japan.
Yeah, I mean, I had a more narrow point on this one. I just I just made the point about, because he's saying, oh, this is not an occupation, it's just like a presence, it's a perfectly legitimate presence. And I just made the point that, like, can you really say that when you went in and removed the original government that was in power, installed your own puppet regime, and oh yeah, they endorse our presence there, so no, it's not an occupation. Like I made that slightly narrower point, but I think you had more of a substantial critique of that one.
Yeah, well, I mean, to me, it was just, in a way, it seems unbelievable that the U.S. could, know that Afghanistan was the graveyard of empires, go in there, waste $2.3 billion, thousands of Americans dead, hundreds of thousands of Afghans dead, and produce absolutely nothing of value in 20 years. I mean, arguably, like, made a lot of the justice in the country worse with the massive amount of corruption that you had, the rampant rape of children. I think it was like in 2006 or so this is a while ago. But, they're quoted, like, for the women saying that the difference was, before you couldn't go out of the house without your husband, but now if you do, you get raped. And that's not better justice. That's not an improvement. You're not, you're maybe shifting some of the problems in the society, but ultimately you're not making anything better. Well, that was all I had on the tweet. Should we get into these articles?
Yeah, man. Yeah, I know there was a couple like more longer, a little more substantial op-eds that you wanted to get into. There was one by Paul Wolfowitz and another by Bob Kagan, both of whom have been like very major, massive cheerleaders for the war on terror from its very inception. Kagan, I think, is more of like a think tanker and like an academic, but Wolfowitz actually worked in Bush's Pentagon and directly helped to lie us into the Iraq War. So what are they arguing? What's their position right now?
Yeah, so I guess these are a little different in that Wolfowitz was, a lot of people call him the architect of the Iraq War, but heavily involved in crafting the Afghan War too, where Kagan has been like a think tank person the whole time. However, his wife is Victoria Nuland, and just kind of one interesting thing on that before we get rolling. Throughout the Trump administration, any time that George Conway said anything bad about Trump, they made it a whole family issue with Kellyanne Conway and got the daughter involved in all of this. I haven't heard anybody say a peep about Victoria Nuland, who's arguably a far more influential person within the Biden administration than
dangerous.
Kellyanne was in Trump's. But anyways, to get into this Robert Kagan article, Will, you're not going to believe this. He opens by citing Americans long remembered when they learned about the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, the shock and horror of that event, in which a German submarine deliberately sank a British ocean liner with nearly 2,000 men, women, and children on board, produced more than moral outrage. He says this ultimately what led the Americans into the First World War, right? So almost unbelievable. This guy cites one of the most famous examples of war propaganda, but is framing this whole thing. His whole first couple of paragraphs here, his argument is that, that going into the war, into World War I was a good thing, and that, the Americans, like, fear and everything, drove them into that war. But what happened is that over a couple of years, that fear and anger dissipated, and he claims that what led to World War II wasn't an American entry into World War I, which everybody who, knows pretty much anything now. I don't even think this is like really that like much even revisionist history, that it was the American intervention into World War I that caused the unilateral Allied victory in that war, and for them to be able to impose the harshest and most ridiculous war reparations and war debt on Germany that led to crazy poverty in Germany. They also stripped away like traditional German territories, and this is eventually the humiliation in Germany that led to the rise of Hitler, right? But no, according to him, the righteous, intervention after the sinking of the Lusitania was good, and we should have stayed involved because we did, and that's how we ended up with World War II. So this guy knows absolutely nothing about history, but he kind of gets into and does make some good points here about Americans being absolutely terrorized after 9/11, and he writes, the feelings and perceptions of the threat that led them to war in Afghanistan have faded, and all that is left are the consequences of that decision, the cost in lives and money. And it's absolutely interesting to me, Will, that he's almost admitting that we went in, we made this decision, like an emotional decision in Afghanistan to go in, and now we're left with the consequences. But he's saying that no, we just need to be back on our emotional outrage and high to continue this war, is ultimately what he ends up arguing for here. So, I mean, there's so much in this article, Will, and I wish I could hit on every single lie that he has. But he talks in here about the fear that was created by, the WMD narrative and stuff like that, which is absolutely unbelievable because, again, this is a well-known war propaganda narrative. There was no WMDs in Iraq, and even if there was, Saddam Hussein didn't have any ties to Al-Qaeda.
Hype.
Right. He was never going to give a nuclear weapon to Al-Qaeda to blow everybody in the United States up. I remember, being a kid growing up in this, Will, it started when I was 11 years old. Every football game, every shopping mall, every Christmas, every Thanksgiving, every parade, every 4th of July, every Memorial Day, every Veterans Day, every election. Warning, somebody could give a bomb to a terrorist and they could blow everybody up. And so for that reason, we have to go into Iraq. And in fact, one of the lies that I actually remember as a kid that terrified me was from Bob Kagan and Bill Kristol when they said that Saddam Hussein was helping extremist terrorist training camp in Iraq with a 707 practicing hijackings, and it was filled with non-Iraqi radical Muslim men. Just a straight up lie that they published, right? And I mean, it's shocking to me that the Washington Post doesn't have an editorial note in here like, hey, this guy says Americans were scared of WMDs. Part of the reason they were scared is because of the lies that he was telling. Just a description of him that's funny, by the way, is from Andrew Basovich saying that Bob Kagan is the chief neocon foreign policy theorist. So that's one of the reasons why I want to spend so much time on this article too, Will. It's just because he really is a key neocon and a central figure in their whole world. I mean, he helped found PNAC with Bill Kristol. He was with the Carnegie Endowment for Peace, Brookings, CFR. Again, married to Victoria Nuland. Worked with Elliot Abrams, with Foreign Affairs. Just so many different roles that he has had in crafting these wars and foreign policies. Go ahead.
I was going to say, and if you look in a lot of media reports, you will see the Institute for the Study of War cited as an expert think tank thing, and that's him too. So that he has a lot of influence all over media, even when his name's not directly on it.
So, Will, there's a lot of stuff in here about the beginning of the Afghan war and what the Bush Afghan war policy was. And as interesting as it would be to get into it, read Fool's Errand is really the best way to debunk all this stuff. I would have to spend hours going through it, and Scott does it just so much more concisely than I can in there. He cites polling, and basically, Will, any time that he wants to justify something that he did that was bad, or justify a war that didn't turn out well, he's like, well, Americans supported it. But anytime he wants to do something that Americans don't support, he say, well, it doesn't turn out well because Americans didn't support it, like leaving the war and stuff like that. But I really want to get towards the end here, although he does make an interesting note and kind of says that, Bush was right when Woodward just says that, he wanted to kill people, and that was kind of the Afghan policy going into that war. And it's just, kind of is very similar to, what we see in the U.S. nation building effort in Libya, where here in Afghanistan, you have him talking about that the Bush administration would have been happy with any stable non-Taliban government in Afghanistan. And he just says that without realizing the big issue is that there is no stable non-Taliban government in Afghanistan. Right? That just doesn't exist. And so you could spend $2 trillion trying to build one, but it will not work. Another thing that he writes in here that's absolutely shocking, Will, is he actually says that the people who criticize the war, and its critics wrongfully say that our leaders never warned us that it wasn't going well. He cites one time in 2012 when Petraeus said that things might not not be going so great, but that they were working on it. Like they had some successes and failures. But he writes this in the Washington Post that published the Afghanistan papers, where you have U.S. officials like Donald Rumsfeld saying, we didn't know who we are fighting in Afghanistan. Or Douglas Lute, who was a general, calling it a self-ligging ice cream cone. I believe he's the one who said we didn't have a foggiest notion of who the enemy was. Or other officials saying that every time that they were producing statistics that showed the war was failing, they would just switch and come up with new statistics and stop measuring the old stuff. Deliberately misleading the American people is what the Afghan papers showed. And the Washington Post allows Robert Kagan to write that didn't happen in their own paper. I don't understand how you could have a paper and allow that to happen.
Yeah, it's incredible. It's incredible that these people continue to have credibility at all. That could have been said 10 years ago. I think that they had completely lost all credibility. But yeah, just they continue to have these spots, these nice cushy spots. If he wants to publish an op-ed in one of the top newspapers in the country, go ahead, no problem. That's not an issue for him.
Yeah. So I guess we should just move on to like kind of where he's wrapping up and starts to talk about who should be held responsible for this war and things like that, Will. And there is a unbelievable sentence in here. He says, why does every American setback have to be a morale detail, a search for scapegoats, and an indictment of an American foreign policy in general? So, Will, the guy who is partly responsible for all of this, for 9/11, because he was advocating for the foreign interventions before it that led to the eventual blowback. I mean, he wanted to overthrow Saddam. But, since that didn't happen, we end up with the blowback 9/11. And now he's saying that we shouldn't be looking for scapegoats. We shouldn't be looking for a larger lesson of this war. We shouldn't be reassessing our foreign policy. He just wants us to stay the course and not learn a single goddamn thing from this. It's infuriating that he's allowed to write this. Or I guess the other thing is if you're the Washington Post and you're going to run something like this, you better allow Matthew Ho, Danny Sherjan, Daniel Davis, somebody in that category to write an article in response to this thing, because there are just so many lies packed in here. I probably hit on maybe a quarter of the outright lies in this article, or things that are just misleading, like framing the whole start of the Afghan war without mentioning that the Taliban offered to hand over Osama bin Laden and surrender, pretending like that didn't happen, just completely conflating Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, and just saying that the Taliban, are going to open a safe haven for the for Al-Qaeda. But I want to mention the last paragraph of this article. He says, when Americans went to war in 2001, most believed that the dangers of inaction had become too great. The threats of both international terrorism and weapons of mass destruction were growing, and that serious efforts had to be made to address them. Today, Americans increasingly believe that those earlier perceptions were mistaken or even manufactured. With America's departure from Afghanistan, we begin to learn who was more right. So a couple things here that are very problematic. Of course, the obvious one is that, you made up a bunch of lies and scared Americans into this war. So they were manufactured. And he almost kind of admits it here, but not really. It's kind of crazy that he does that. But then now he's saying if anything bad happens, Will, it's the fault of the non-interventionists. It's the fault of the people that want to stay out of this war. That's a really disturbing trend. Now, one other thing, actually, I forgot, that is actually the sentence before this, that is one of the most sociopathic things I have ever read. If someone had told Americans after 9/11 that they could go 2 decades without another successful attack, but that it would cost 4,000 American lives and $1 trillion, as well as tens of thousands of Afghan lives, they would have rejected it as too high. Likely not. So he is saying that if Americans could look at what the Afghan war was in 2001, they would have signed on to it. It's absolutely ridiculous and not true. Also, he undercounts everything. It's 2.3 trillion. It's far more than 4,000 American lives, and it's far more than tens of thousands of Afghan lives. But it's just absolutely sociopathic that he thinks that, we could kill Afghans as long as it, prevents terror attacks in the U.S., which it doesn't even do that. So I don't know, Will, if you had anything else on this article, but it took me quite a while to read it because I was a little heated when I was reading that.
Yeah, I haven't even read the whole thing in full. I've just skimmed over it a little bit. But yeah, just some of those arguments there are absolutely ridiculous. Like, ask Americans now, and I'm pretty sure I don't know if it's a majority, but a large plurality does not think that those costs were worth it. So, I think it's more important to ask them after the fact than before. But even if, I don't know, like, I just completely reject that whole thing. Oh yeah, if you would have presented these costs to the American people and said, is this worth it? Like, I don't even buy that. But then, yeah, he vastly understates those costs. If you included the full costs in there, I'm not so sure they would have, would be okay with it.
I don't know if they would be okay with it as is. Like only 3,000 Americans died on 9/11. You're killing more since then. Also, right. This whole "there's no major attack" thing is absolutely ridiculous. As Scott Horton points out, the 9/11 attack was, the 1 in a million shot that they actually got through and were able to pull off something that successful. But there have been several attacks in the U.S. and hundreds of people have died in the years since. And in Europe, I think even more with like the Madrid bombings and the what was it, Death Eagle concert in France, in Paris, and the Ariana Grande concert in the UK and things like that.
But and then not to mention the entire Islamic State, like us being there didn't prevent them from arising,
Right. Well, let's hit on this Wolfowitz article now. This one in the Wall Street Journal titled "The Forever War Hasn't Ended," and he starts off this article, Will, by saying that basically the United States is making a mistake by ending the forever wars because as the attack by ISIS-K shows that the enemy gets a say in ending those wars and we can't end the war because they're still attacking us. Which is absolutely absurd because the war against the Islamic State Khorasan group was never ending, and the Biden administration has said it like 4 or 5 times in the days leading up to the attack on the Kabul airport. They were talking about how ISIS-K was a threat, how they're going to maintain the over-horizon capability, all this kind of stuff. They're directly saying that they're not going to end the war against ISIS-K. And so that's the really first misleading thing that I found in this article. Another thing that he brings up later in the article, but I think it ties in well here, is there's a lot of conflation with the Taliban and ISIS-K, and people also conflating the idea with the United States signing a deal with the Taliban to the Taliban signing a deal with the Afghan government. And people say that this proved that you cannot trust the Taliban, but I think it shows just the opposite. The Taliban have not actually violated the Dawa agreement, as far as it goes throughout this whole thing. Now, I think there was things in there saying that they weren't going to take major cities, but they didn't start doing that till after the U.S. broke the agreement by staying. And so when you look at where the violations were of the agreement, I think this actually had this whole thing, if anything to me, Will, has shown that the United States can actually successfully work with the Taliban, as far as the evacuation from the Kabul airport goes, as far as, there not being shots fired between the U.S. and the Taliban for all this time. No Taliban killing American soldiers for the past 18 months. That goes to show that, the U.S. can work with the Taliban. Now, Hawks want you to believe the exact opposite is true. But if you just look at the reality of what's been unfolding, I think that's a complete lie. Wolfowitz, like Kagan, invokes a lot of the post 9/11 fear and saying Americans have forgotten that. And that's, a lot of what he chalks the problems up to. He says that the Taliban enabled the attack on American soil, which I think is a pretty debatable point, Will. We could start, I don't want to get into all these nitpicky things because, again, you just got to read Fool's Errand to know it all. And I don't want to spend another half hour here breaking all these things down. But, the Taliban did offer to give up Osama bin Laden, tried to signal to the Americans that they could take him before 9/11 happened, certainly offered to give him up after. But they really do try to leave out that narrative in this whole thing.
Yeah, something with this whole safe haven myth that they often cite as if Afghanistan is uniquely, specially designed for terrorist planning or something. But the 9/11 attacks were planned from all over the world. They were planned in Hamburg, Germany. They were planned in cities in Florida. There's nothing special about Afghanistan that allows a terrorist presence to plan something. It's just a ridiculous idea. And if anything, it's extremely far away from anything important, of any, Western city or Western target. Afghanistan is like exile.
Right. One of the things he says in here, Will, is that Biden says ISIS-K and Taliban are rivals, but they may work together against the common enemy in the United States. And he says this, without mentioning that the U.S. that the way that this triangle has gone of enemies is actually the U.S. working with the Taliban against ISIS-K, not the other way around. And to completely leave out that history is extremely misleading and dishonest. He says that Americans only supported the withdrawal because they didn't realize the other option was the rise of enabling terrorist groups and terrorist safe haven in Afghanistan. Which is completely absurd. That's not even the foregone conclusion, and that's just what he's making. It's also, I don't think, really fair for him to just come right out and say that. Now, he has a prescription in here, Will, for I think 4 things that Biden should do. He says, 1, he needs to tell Americans that the war on terror will be really long. He says 4,000 Americans died, 400,000 American military personnel died in the 4 years of World War II. And so, we should expect that this could be very long, 75 years or so. And that, long wars aren't the worst kind of things. Now, what he's really talking about here, Will, is something that Matt Boot has laid out far more grotesquely, which is basically that they want Americans to fight forever wars in these countries to try to build little American states. And the way they're going to do this is essentially through genocide, where they're going to continue to kill in those countries anybody who opposes the American way of life until whoever is left will complies. And Matt Boot has directly compared this to what the Americans did in the American, Indian Native American wars, right?
Right.
So, this kind of disturbing thing. And, I do think that these people are enough of sociopathic genocidal monsters to actually think that's what needs to be done here. So, that's one of the things he points at, one of the things he calls for Biden to do. He says it was a mistake to trust the Taliban and for Biden to ignore the Taliban aggression, and that the U.S. should have carried out more airstrikes. I'm not sure what we could do about that now. He says that third, choosing to avoid forever wars by abandoning our Afghan allies was both costly and dishonorable. This is the old war hawk trope that we heard after the U.S. tried to pull out of Syria under Trump. We're abandoning our allies, Will. Oh no, it's so terrible. And that's kind of where they go to. Of course, he rolls out another famous hawkish trope calling Biden Neville Chamberlain. So I don't know why exactly hawks are allowed to make references to the Holocaust and to World War II without being called anti-Semitic, but I think we should just go for it and say that was a anti-Semitic thing and he should be canceled for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, he goes again in this one section in these 3 paragraphs. Will he maybe hits on the 3 biggest warhawk tropes? The other ones, we didn't learn the lesson from the Iraq withdrawal because we're withdrawing from Afghanistan now, and hell, this one is even worse because look, they took over the country far faster than the Islamic State rose in Iraq. Yep. He says that it was wrong for Biden to say that the U.S. bore the brunt of this fight. And in this point, I actually think he's kind of making a decent point that gets left out, although he's not really, saying it for the reasons that he should be saying it. That when we talk about the Americans who have died in this war, I think 4,000 to 6,000 if you include contractors, that's absolutely tragic. But 66,000 Afghans have, died fighting for the American cause here too. too, Will. And I have to imagine that there's a lot of people among those ranks who, because the Americans came into the country and, basically were like over half of the economy, it was the Americans or heroin to make money in Afghanistan, that a lot of young men didn't have any choice but to join the ANA. And then the U.S. shipped them to Helmand, a place that was, as foreign to them as a lot of, Afghanistan was to Americans. And then, they end up getting killed there. And so, Biden saying that this was all in the U.S. military is unfair in that way. However, for his part, he says that Biden is exaggerating the cost of staying and that really we could lose about 20 men a year, and that's okay. And so, of course, I don't think he's volunteering to be one of those 20 men or for his kids or anybody in his family to be, but he's okay with, 20 Americans dying every year. Now, this is all kinds of misleading, Will, because he says, look, we could keep 3,500 troops in Afghanistan. It would be no problem. Of course, he fails to mention that's only because Trump has signed that deal, and there'll probably be a hell of a lot more than the 13 dead Americans so far in 2021 in Afghanistan have Biden just broke the deal. Now, he also has 3 actions for Biden to take. He says the first and most urgent is to attend to the safety of Americans, and he wants to do this by making a bunch of threats to the Taliban, which, unless the Taliban are doing something towards the Americans, you shouldn't start threatening them, because, hell, maybe the Taliban will just, do it because you're telling them to do something that they know they can do. But I kind of doubt that'll happen, but it's just an absurd point to make and just some grandstanding that he's doing. Second, he says we need to threaten China, which is almost even more absurd, Will, because this is a case where China does border Afghanistan, will probably have more influence in Afghanistan moving forward. And if the U.S. is concerned about Afghan nationals or American civilians, China may be a partner that we could work with to get those people out of Afghanistan. And yet you have the U.S. doing things like sailing warships through the Taiwan Strait, and and Paul Wolfowitz is saying we should be aggressive against China, when I think the exact opposite should happen. And then the third thing is he says we need to give more aid and comfort to our allies in our Gulf Arab allies, which is absolutely hilarious, because a big reason that he says we need to stay in Afghanistan is for the Afghan people. Of course, Saudi Arabia, I'm sure one of the states he's talking about we need to give more support to, is just as brutal to their civilians as the Taliban will probably be. The last thing he says, just like Kagan, very disturbing, Will, is basically saying Americans are going to experience another 9/11 now that we're leaving. So that's why I had on that article out. If you have anything to add, go for it.
I'm sure that last part about the new 9/11 will drive the conspiracy kooks crazy. These are the same people who talked about with their under the Project for a New American Century, how we need a new Pearl Harbor to galvanize a new, So I'm sure that little line at the end will drive the conspiratoids nuts. All right, no, man, you did a great job summarizing those columns. Those are some of the top worst neocon warhawks, architects of the war on terror, and yeah, you did a great job tearing them down.
All right, well, I guess we should wrap there. We're already over an hour. I know we had a couple things on China, but I'll say that for later in the week. Everybody, thank you so much for the year that we've got to do this show. Yes. The fact that it's grown and that we've gotten support, and that this is our career. That me and Will do this show, and then Will works at RT. I work at antiwar.com and the Libertarian Institute. But this is what we do. So any way that you could support us, we put the money back into the show and also being able to live our lives. So you could donate at Patreon, Subscribestar. A huge thank you to Scott Horton at the Libertarian Institute for hosting this show.
Absolutely.
I think me and Will both see Scott as something of a mentor and somebody who has really helped us to learn and find our way in the anti-war community. And it's so great to be able to host our show with Scott, Pete, Keith Knight, Patrick McFarlane, and Tommy Solomons over at the Libertarian Institute.
Great.
Yep. So yeah, everybody, just make sure you're subscribing to the show. Again, most people who are listening on YouTube aren't subscribed, so if you're listening right now, you made it all the way through the show, make sure you hit the subscribe button. Same thing on Facebook. Most people aren't, like 80-90% of people who are watching, listening on Facebook aren't subscribed. Hit the subscribe, follow, like button, whatever the hell it is. We're on Twitter. We're on MeWe. Will is at the Will Porter on Twitter. I'm at Kyle Anzalone _. And this has been absolutely great, Will. Thanks.
Thanks, y'all. Thanks for the last year. Peace out.